Electronic surveillance. The court began to develop the law of electronic surveillance in the 1920s. At the beginning, the law of electronic surveillance actually was developed based on the property law. Meaning is, when the court was making the determination whether the police violated the suspect's constitutional right or not, the court would see whether there was a violation of the defendant's property right. That is, whether there was police trespassing. We know, suppose police want to go to a person's house to install a listening device in the suspect's phone, and the police, to do that, the police need to have a warrant from a judge. We know if a police want to enter a person's home, the police need probable cause. The police also need a warrant. If a police would go to a suspect's house without a warrant to install this listening device, that would be illegal. That would be in violation of the person's Fourth Amendment right, because in that case the police would be committing a trespassing. So the police, in that sense, would violate the person's property right. So of course, while conducting this electronic surveillance, if a police violated the suspect's property right, and then the police would also violate the person's Fourth Amendment right. So in this early stage of this development of electronic surveillance law, the court mainly look at whether there was a property law, whether there's a violation of the defendant's property right. The court abandoned this approach in the 1967 when the court decided this Cass versus United States. In this Cass decision, the police attached a listening device to the outside of a public phone booth because the police suspected the defendant would go there to make a phone call and to transmit this illegal gambling information through the phone. So the police actually conducted this electronic surveillance, and the police indeed intercepted this conversation. The defendant talked about this illegal gambling operation over the phone. So the issue in the case was whether there was this police electronic surveillance, whether this surveillance violated the defendant's Fourth Amendment right or not. The prosecution argued there was no violation of the defendant's constitutional right because there was no police trespassing. The prosecution argued public phone booth was not the defendant's property, so police did not go to the defendant's house to install this listening device. This public telephone booth was not defendant's property, so the police did not violate the defendant's property right in any sense. But starting from this case, the court said we are not going to follow this property law-based approach anymore. The court said the Fourth Amendment, the court in this case actually said there was a police violation, even though the police attached this listening device outside of a public telephone booth. But the court still said there was a violation of the defendant's Fourth Amendment right. Why the court ruled this way? Because the court said the Fourth Amendment protects people, not places. So we cannot really only look at whether there was a police violation of the defendant's property right or not. We need to look at whether, because Fourth Amendment should not only protect the places, it should protect the people. And most specifically, the court said the Fourth Amendment protects people's legitimate expectation of privacy. So this legitimate expectation of privacy issue, we have discussed this several times already, but it is important for us to know it is starting from this case versus United States. The court began to rely on this concept of a legitimate expectation of privacy to determine whether there was a violation of the defendant's Fourth Amendment right or not. In this case, the court said when a person goes to a public telephone booth to make a telephone call, the person should have the legitimate expectation of privacy that his conversation should not be overheard. So in this case, even though the police attached this listening device to the outside of the telephone booth, nonetheless, the police actually violated the defendant's legitimate expectation of privacy. So the police in the case violated the defendant's Fourth Amendment right. So this is what happened in Katz versus United States, and then we need to look at the next case, that is United States versus White. This case, of course, also involves police conducting electronic surveillance. The defendant had several conversations with a police informant. Of course, the defendant did not know the person was a police informant. And then the police informant was wearing an electronic transmitter, and then this transmitter actually transmitted the conversation to the police. And the police also recorded this conversation. And in the conversation, of course, the defendant implicated himself in drug dealing. So the issue here in the case was whether this police conduct of electronic surveillance violated the defendant's Fourth Amendment right. The defendant argued this electronic surveillance violated his Fourth Amendment right because the defendant argued, I did not know this informant, this person I was talking to was a police informant, and I did not know the person was wearing this electronic transmitter, and he would transmit the conversation to the police, and this really violated my legitimate expectation of privacy, because we understand in Katz decision, the court said Fourth Amendment protects people's legitimate expectation of privacy. But in this case, the court said the ruling of the court in this case was there was no police violation. The court said this case was really different from Katz. The court said in this case the issue was the defendant actually misplaced his trust. So the issue here is if the defendant misplaced his trust, he had to take the consequences. What do I mean by this misplaced trust? Because the defendant had this conversation with this police informant, but he just thought this informant was his friend. He just, of course, he did not know the informant was, that the person was a police informant, but the court said, even though that was the case, the defendant voluntarily had the conversation with his friend. The friend, of course, was a police informant. In that sense, the defendant misplaced his trust. But if the defendant did that, he had to take the consequence. So the court said we cannot really protect the defendant if the defendant mistrusts someone. So the court said there was no violation of the defendant's legitimate expectation of privacy. The reason was the defendant conducted this conversation voluntarily. So that's why there was no police violation. We need to look at this difference between Cass and White, so that we can understand exactly what we mean by this. Police, under what kind of circumstances police may conduct this electronic surveillance. We know in Cass, the defendant was in a telephone booth having a telephone conversation. And then the police actually attached this listening device to the outside of the booth and then intercepted the conversation. If a police would do that, that was a violation of the defendant's Fourth Amendment right. Because when the defendant was having this telephone conversation, he had this legitimate expectation of privacy. The conversation would not be overheard by other people. But what happened in White was different. The White actually voluntarily had the conversation with the police informant, and then the issue once again was an issue of misplaced trust. We need to understand this. If without this electronic surveillance part, if White actually had this conversation with this police informant. He thought the person was his friend. And then if the person would go to the police in person to report to the police what White actually told him, could the person do that? Of course, the person could do that. If we have this suspect, and if we have this suspect committed a crime, and then the suspect would tell his friend what crime he committed, we cannot really say this person who heard the story could not go to the police to report the crime. It cannot be. If a suspect would have a conversation with someone, the person would say, I just committed this crime, but I just want to tell you about this crime I committed. You cannot really tell anyone else. You cannot go there to report to the police because that is my expectation of privacy. We know it cannot be simply because a suspect said that, and then the person who heard this crime story could not really go to the police to report the crime. We know, of course, that the person cannot really expect that. If a person would reveal the crime he committed, anyone who heard this story could go to the police to report this crime. I'm sure we all understand that. So if we know a person who heard a crime story could go to the police to report the story, and then in this White decision, the court said, and then what is the difference between while the conversation was conducted, and then this police informant would wear this electronic transmitter, would transmit the conversation directly to the police. The court said there is no difference. The person who heard this crime story could go to the police in person to repeat the story. If the person could do that, and then what is the difference between that and the person would wire this electronic device to transmit the conversation directly to the police? The court said there is no difference between these two. So the court said so long as the suspect voluntarily revealed the crime he committed, and he could not really claim he had any legitimate expectation of privacy in that. If the person indeed expect privacy in whatever he did, he should not really tell his story to anyone. If he reveals what he did to another person, and then he simply would not have any legitimate expectation of privacy anymore. So that person actually is free to go to the police to report the story, or the person could also transmit the conversation directly to the police.